Hello everyone, I'm back again, and I just wanted to discuss 120 frames per second, also known as 120 hertz. So, the media has really blown this out of proportion, guys. It's actually not as big of a deal as everybody thinks it is. And, if you do not have an LG OLED or a TV with HDMI 2.1, you're not really missing out on anything. Allow me to explain why. So a lot of people have been saying, especially with the Xbox Series X, that there's a bunch of games now that support 120 frames per second, and why isn't the PlayStation 5 doing that? First, let me start out with that argument. So the first thing you should know is, yes, you are getting 120 frames per second on some games on the Series X, but mostly for older titles. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to have. But I want you guys to understand that when it comes to newer titles, however, you are limited. So it's very similar to what the PlayStation 4 Pro did back in the day, where if you could have 60 frames per second at the sacrifice of resolution, like have a focus on frame rate, or you could have a focus on graphics, but take a hit to frame rate. And it's the same thing all over again, except now it's 60 frames per second with high dynamic range, HDR, 4K, or 120 frames per second at 1080p or 1440p without HDR. Or etc. Like, it's something similar to that. Not every game is going to be the same. But the reason why this topic was inspired was because recently I've been reading about Mass Effect Legendary Edition. And people are like, oh, the Xbox Series X got a 120 frames per second patch. Why didn't the PS5? Well, because they wanted to focus on what they thought gamers would find more important, which is graphics and a smooth, buttery 60 frames per second. Now, why do they think that that's more important? Because Sony knows their audience, and you know what, for the record, Microsoft does too. But here's the thing. Most of their audience doesn't own HDMI 2.1 TVs. Most of you probably still have HDMI 2.0. And you are able to get 4K at 60 frames per second high dynamic range. And guess what? There's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing at all. 120 frames per second at this point in time is still kind of out of the range of console players, unless of course you're willing to sacrifice graphics. So, or resolution rather. So, let's take this game in front of you here, for example. It doesn't have a patch or anything, okay? This is the PS4 version of Judgment. But let's say it did get a patch. I could play this game at 60 frames per second, HDR, or I could sacrifice resolution of 4K and HDR to gain 120 frames per second, or I could sacrifice resolution and still get 120 frames per second HDR. The point is, you're still going to be losing something in order to get that 120 frames per second. Although the FPS boost mode is very nice in the Series X, most of it is just jumping 30 frames per second games to 60 frames per second. And remember, these are the older titles, so it's a lot easier for the extra horsepower of the Series X to tap into to basically just boost the games in question. The PS5, because it knows, or rather Sony knows, that most of their consumer base is still on 60 frames per second high dynamic range, so they know that if they focus on that, most of their audience will benefit. Now, back it up a bit though, it's not just Sony that knows this, Microsoft knows it too. That's why 120 frames per second is optional. So in Mass Effect Legendary Edition, you can have the same thing. Mass Effect at 60 frames per second, high dynamic range, or you can sacrifice, and also 4K, or you can sacrifice 4K, drop down to 1080p, but get 120 frames per second HDR. I think. I'm not entirely sure, don't quote me on that. So, again, even though the Series X is technically the more powerful console, and technically it can do 120 frames per second, in the long run, it really doesn't matter, guys. It doesn't matter at all. I'm sorry. Like, I've had this TV since last year, the B9 OLED, and I have barely even scratched the surface of use with the 120 frames per second. It actually made me question whether or not I actually needed to upgrade, but I will say that in terms of gaming picture quality, OLED does it for me. Doesn't mean it's going to do it for everyone, but that is the main reason why I haven't regretted my purchase. However, where I do regret my purchase is I really thought that 120 frames per second was going to be the thing this generation. I got hooked line and sinker by the marketing campaigns, and I'm sure a lot of you have too. But again, we're with early technology, guys, and so nothing really, at least at the present moment, still fully takes advantage of it other than PC. PC will take full advantage of 120 frames per second high dynamic range, but you need a powerhouse of a PC in order to even achieve that. So, you know, I say don't fall for the marketing hype, but if you're going to get an OLED, don't get the OLED for 120 frames per second. Get it for HDMI 2.1. Get it for 60 frames per second high dynamic range at, the lowest response time and the best possible picture. But don't expect that all of your next-gen games are going to run at 120 frames per second, even on the latest technology. On that note, guys, I'd be appreciative if you smash the like button. Helps this channel out a lot. Smash the dislike button if you think I'm a big nerd and that I ranted about this for just way too long. Ding that bell if you want to see what I come out with next. Now would be an amazing time to subscribe if you haven't already done so. I am always appreciative as this channel continues to grow and grow and grow, and I'm very happy to see where it's gone. If you haven't, I already said that. Sorry guys, I'm tired. And this is the time to say stay healthy, stay safe in this pandemic, and I'll see you guys in the next one. But I have a question for you guys before I go, and you can blast me in the comment section below if you like. Do you think that 120 frames per second is more important than what I said? Or do you think that it's actually an undersold feature? Or do you think that perhaps in the future, perhaps a PlayStation 5 Pro will take more advantage of it? Or maybe a Series X Pro? Or maybe a Nintendo Switch Pro? Or do you think that it's just more marketing gimmicks? On that note, guys, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.